Hello, Nick Leifker here, and welcome to this presentation on a research project that myself, David Kunch, and Ron Sicker have been working on for the past year or so, a research project on team testing. Now, you may have seen the announcement for this particular presentation several months ago. However, the recording, well, one of the problems that occurs when you take a live recording and try to make a recording of it is that sometimes it gets messy, sometimes it gets just kind of boring, and frankly, because of the informal nature of the presentation, it generally would not have really been useful with regard to a presentation. Basically, you probably would have gotten bored with it in the next 5 minutes and just turned it off. So after dealing with some other things, most notably a summer course, I decided to go back and re-record this and make it available for all of the faculty at St. John Fisher. Basically, we have a research project that, well, if you want to join us, you're welcome to. We can certainly use help, and the more data that is available, the better. So, what we're going to go over with regard to this presentation, first of all, we're going to go over the reasoning behind our research. We're going to go over several goals that we intend to seek with this particular research project. We're going to go over the process. In other words, how does an instructor contribute to this particular research project? How does an instructor get involved with this particular research project? And we're also going to go over some of our future plans with regard to this project. So, why team testing? Well, this is a reflection of the real world. In the real world, people very rarely operate alone. The real world, in general, operates in teams, operates in groups. As a result, a greater amount of the classwork that has been done, in particular within the business school, but within all aspects of academia, is done in teams. So, that said, we have a lot of work in teams, but we're not all too sure about the effects of that teamwork. So the question is, what makes a successful team? What makes a satisfied team? And keep in mind, these are not the same things. Oftentimes, a successful team may not be a particularly happy one. Sometimes a happy team may not be a successful team. So what makes a successful team? What makes a satisfied team? And more to the point, can we design more effective teams for the classroom? After all, if we can design effective teams for the classroom, hopefully that can facilitate learning for our students. Now, there isn't a lot of research in this area. More to the point, there is some disagreement with regard to how effective team involvement is, how effective working in teams can be. So, to that end, we have developed this particular research project. Now, the primary areas that we seek to address are fairly straightforward. First, how much does a student learn? What has a student learned? So, we want to have some idea as to how much the student has learned and retained in terms of material. We also intend to investigate how much the student thinks they've learned with regard to the material. How much, what is their perceived retention, if you will. After all, there is a difference between what a student has learned and what a student thinks they've learned. We also intend to investigate the student's perception of the effectiveness of teams within the classroom, and also we intend to investigate the effect of personality with regard to how well a team performs, with how well a team learns. So, we have some things that we want to investigate, some things that we want to look into with regard to this research. So, what is our process? Well, the first thing is that we need information. We need to gather demographic data and psychological data on our students. In particular, one of the things that we use is what's known as the Neo-PIR personality test, and we'll discuss the results of that shortly. Also, we will have team testing in the classroom. In other words, with each exam, part of the exam will be done individually and part will be done in a group. And then once the testing is done, we survey the students. What is their feelings? What are their opinions with regard to team testing? And then, once we have all this information, Well, we look at the data, we examine the data, we examine student performance and their attitudes with regard to team testing to see what combinations of demographic and psychological makeup make for successful and or satisfied teams. Again, I do want to emphasize that these are not the same things, that successful teams are not necessarily happy teams. Now, at the beginning of the semester, the first thing to do is to get permission. After all, we are going to be collecting psychological data, and that means getting IRB involved. So, at the beginning of the semester, we hand out IRB permission forms to be handed out and signed. Now, it is important to emphasize to the students that we will not access this information until long after the course is completed. In the case of the courses that occurred this past year, we were not able to access them until this summer. Also, once these forms are turned in, the instructor will need to sign each form after they're turned in. So this allows us access to both demographic and psychological data, and this also includes their GPA. Now, if the instructor wishes to assign teams at the course of the entire semester, well, that'll be done at that time. After all, in some cases, we do want the same team for the entire semester so that students have advance notice of whether or not of the composition of their teams. There are some cases where we do have this advance notice. There are some cases where we don't have this advance notice, and I'll talk about that in more detail later. Now, the NEO-PIR personality test. How this works is that students have about 40 minutes to read 240 statements, and you'll give this in class at the beginning of the semester. And so they'll take this little exam, and they'll read 240 statements, and they'll state whether or not they strongly disagree, are neutral, agree, or strongly agree with the statement. Now, again, it is strongly recommended to give this test in class. It's not necessary, in some cases tests could be completed at home, but in general we've found that the best way to get a high response rate is to give the test in class. Now, some example statements from the NEO-PIR personality test. I am not a worrier. Students will look at this statement and say, do I strongly disagree, or neutral, agree, or strongly agree with this? Another example. Over the years, I've done some pretty stupid things. Well, do they strongly disagree? Do they strongly agree? They'll look at this statement and ask this question. Another example. I keep my belongings neat and clean. Another example. I'd really have to be sick before I'd miss a day of work. And then, well, one of the more interesting ones, I wouldn't enjoy vacationing in Las Vegas. Students will read these statements and, we're not asking them to significantly think about the statement, but just, do you agree or disagree? That's the basic essence of the NEO-PIR personality test. So students will read 240 statements like this, and will state whether or not they agree or disagree with that statement. Now, the way the NEO-PIR personality test works is it assesses 5 core personality dimensions. It assesses neuroticism, it assesses extroversion, it assesses openness to experiences, it assesses agreeableness, and it assesses conscientiousness. And what the personality test does from that point is it combines them. It combines these areas to form 10 characteristics, such as well-being, learning style, and impulse control, as we'll see in just a moment. For instance, to find a student's style of activity, we look at both their extroversion score and their conscientiousness score. If a person is both an extrovert and are conscientious, well, that means that they're a go-getter. It means that they're active, efficient, productive, and more to the point, they're on task. They know what needs to be done, and they're ready to pitch in. On the other hand, if they're extreme extroverts, but they're not so conscientious, it means that they have a lot of energy, but they find it hard to focus that energy, to channel that energy into constructive directions. And also, of course, if we have someone who isn't so extroverted, we have people who are plotters, who tend to be methodical, who concentrate on the task, but tend to work slowly and steadily. And then, of course, there's the lethargic who really, they're kind of unenthusiastic, really not all that motivated. So by combining extroversion and conscientiousness, we're able to get an idea as to what style of activity a student has. Another example, anger control. If a person is neurotic and also agreeable, well, they tend to be timid. They tend to be fairly conflicted over anger. After all, they could be severely hurt, but they're reluctant to express it because they want to be agreeable. They don't want to cause conflict. On the other hand, if they are extremely neurotic but aren't so agreeable, then you have temperamental individuals. These are people who are very easily angered. Also, we have the easygoing who aren't that neurotic and are agreeable. These tend to be fairly laid back. And then, of course, there's the cold-blooded individuals, people who are not that neurotic, but are not that agreeable either. They do not get mad, but they get even. So, by combining neuroticism and agreeableness, we're able to see the style of anger control that a student tends to focus on. When we combine openness and agreeableness, we find the style of attitudes that a student has. For instance, if they are extremely open and extremely agreeable, they tend to be extremely progressive, take a thoughtful approach to social problems and are willing to try new solutions. If they are clearly open but not that agreeable, well, they tend to be extremely critical thinkers, extremely free thinkers. After all, these are people who tend to not be swayed neither by tradition nor sentimentality. They tend to find their own way. And then, of course, there are people who aren't that open, who tend to be more traditionalist and who tend to be more resolute in their beliefs. So, going quickly through some of these other examples, we have style of character, which is a combination of agreeableness and conscientiousness. We have the style of defense that a person has, when they feel threatened, which is a combination of neuroticism and openness. We have the style of impulse control that a person generally uses, which we designate as a combination of neuroticism and conscientiousness. We have the way that a student interacts with others, which we generally consider a combination of extroversion and agreeableness. We have the general kinds of interests that a person has, which we create from a combination of extroversion and openness. We have the style of learning that a student prefers, which is a general combination of openness and conscientiousness. And finally, the style of well-being that a student has, based on their neuroticism and extroversion. In other words, whether or not they're optimists, pessimists, low-key, or a bit high-strung. So, from the results of the NEO-PIR personality test, we get an idea as to the aspects of personality for each individual student. And then, when it comes time for testing, we see how those different personalities combine. What works well, what produces a happy environment, what doesn't work well, and what produces a less than ideal environment. Another thing that we do to assess a student's particular skills is we give them what's known as the Ambassadeur Creative Problem-Solving Profile. So how does this work? Students are given 4 words and they're asked to rank them. Which do they like the best, which do they put second, third, and then least. So from these sets of words, from this test, students are classified into one of 4 areas with regard to their strengths and preferences with regard to problem solving. Now, with any good problem, it takes different types, different styles of thinking in order to effectively solve a problem. So we have these 4 groups. First, we have the generator. This is the person who comes up with new and brilliant ideas, who comes up with stuff out of the blue almost. And then there's the conceptualizer. The next step is to form connections. In other words, start defining the problem, start looking at the situation, start seeing what needs to happen in general. And then there's the optimizer. Once the problem is defined by the conceptualizer, they're the one who evaluates. They're the ones who determine the best course of action. They're the ones who look at the different ways that a problem can be solved and then says, let's go this direction. And then there's the implementer. The implementer is the one who takes a course of action and manages it to fruition. The one who takes the goal and sees it through. From this, a creative problem-solving profile is generated for each student. Their strengths, their weaknesses. For instance, this is my own. And as you can see, I am a conceptualizer. This is not unusual for an academic. Now keep in mind, this would actually be unusual for a student. It's just one of those things that lets us know that, sometimes we don't think the same way as our students. But the goal is to see how our students think. In other words, what area of problem solving do they work best at? And from this, we're able to generate a plot such as this. And this is a plot of the entire class. After all, within the class, there's going to be all sorts of different types of problem solvers. There's going to be the generators, the people who create these ideas, who come up with things out of the blue. The conceptualizers, the ones who form connections and figure out how to define the problem. And then there's the optimizers, the ones who ultimately choose the best course of action. And then there's the implementers, the ones who take the idea and run with it. All four of these types of people are needed to effectively solve a problem. And as we see, most of the students that we have tend to be implementers. So it should be interesting to see how this mix differs between, say, the business school and other areas of St. John Fisher College. So, we've given our students personality tests, probably more personality tests than they ever want to see. That said, there's more testing to come. There is, after all, a course for them to take. There's exams for them to take. And for the experiment, we're using 4 different methods for team testing, depending on how much of the exam is in a group format and how those groups are chosen. For instance, groups could be chosen randomly. In other words, they find out the day of the exam who they're going to be teamed with, and could have groups chosen in advance. In other words, they could know several days in advance or even several months in advance who they're going to be working with regard to the exam. And then there is the percentage of the exam that is in the group format, whether or not it's 25% or 50%. Now, on the day of exam, organization is key. Organization is critical. So before the exam, it's necessary to carefully plan the exams to be given. After all, each exam must be divided into 2 parts of roughly equal length and difficulty. Some students will get the first part as individual work, other students will get the second part as individual work. So make copies of each exam so that the individuals within each group will get identical questions. After all, the members within each group will be working on the same problems in the group portion. So you don't want to mix things up, if you will. Now there is one idea, and that is to supply each member of each group a copy of their version of the exam. And there's a reason for this. What we found when we actually implemented team testing this past year, having one copy for the entire group, well, when you have 5 or 6 people in a group, that tends to make things difficult. So one idea is to supply each member of each group a copy of their version of the exam. That way they have a copy to quickly look at over the course of the exam. Now, also, if students are to be put into groups randomly on the day of the exam, it is necessary to select those groups before the exam and keep a record of those groups. Now, when it comes to actually giving the exam, timing how long each part will take may take some time. It's a good idea to start by dividing the time evenly, giving half of the time to the individual portion, half the time to the group portion. And then, well, seeing how long it takes students to complete. How long does it take them to complete the individual portion? How long does it take them to complete the group portion? And after that first exam, divide the available time according to the student needs. Now, some exams may require more discussion in the group part, and thus the group part may take longer. Some exams may take less time with the group portion. It all depends on the nature of your particular course. So first, divide the available time evenly, and then tailor the results of the exam. Tailor the necessary time for each part of the exam to your particular course's needs. Now, there is one other aspect to consider, just in case you have some concerns with regard to this group format, individual format with regard to the exam, and that is that not all of the exam needs to be in this format. For instance, what I do with my course is I have the analytical portion as a take-home exam. That way they have time to solve the problems as needed, but then the conceptual portion of the exam, that I do using the in-class, individual, and group portions for the exam. So I have only part of my exam using the team testing research protocols. So you can tailor how much of the exam you use with regard to these protocols. Now, it's generally a good idea to schedule 3 blocks of time when it comes to each exam. You have 2 larger blocks to complete each portion of the exam, and then 1 smaller block afterwards for students to fill out the survey. Now, an sample division of this, once you've calibrated things, might be 25 minutes for the individual portion, 20 minutes for the group portion, and 10 minutes for the survey in a 55-minute class. So, again, 3 blocks of time. First, you have the 2 large blocks to complete the individual portion and the group portion, and then 1 smaller block afterwards for students to fill out surveys. Now, there is one more aspect that I do need to emphasize, and that is do not look at the surveys given in class. In fact, be obvious about not looking at the surveys given in class, because this is individual, identifiable student data, and that information must remain confidential until after the course has been completed. So be sure that the students clearly understand where each portion of the exam day's paperwork goes. So have 1 folder for the individual portion of the exam, 1 folder for the group portion of the exam, and 1 folder for the surveys afterwards. That way the students understand that the surveys will remain anonymous and separate from the exams themselves, and thus we won't look at them until long after grades have been handed out. Now, after the exam has taken place, well, collect all of the information, collect all of the portions of the exams, collect all the surveys. Surveys you give to David Kunch for storage until the information is entered for calibration. Also, have a record of the teams used in the exams, and eventually the exam grades for each portion. All of this information should eventually go to David for storage. Once grades are recorded and a record of the teams used in the exam are given to David for storage, then the exams may be returned to the students. So, once that's done, what are the plans for the future? Well, right now, we are entering all of this data from the surveys, from the exams, from the personality tests. And what we're eventually going to do is we're going to run a factor analysis on this data to see the patterns that emerge. We're not sure exactly what we're going to find. What makes for good teams, what makes for happy teams, what makes for both. We're not sure, but we're going to run a factor analysis to find out and analyze the results to determine our observations and conclusions. So, what makes a successful team? What makes a happy team? Are these two incongruent? Do they work? Are they hand in hand, or are they in opposition? Is conflict useful, perhaps, with regard to successful teams? All of these are things that we hope to find out with regard to our research. So, these are the courses that we've given this particular research in so far. Ron Sicker's course on managing organizational behavior, Management 211. Given it in process management also, Management 328. It's been given in my Management 409 and 590 classes in operations management. And it's also been given in David Kunch's courses on strategy and strategic management, Management 432 and GMGT 681. Now you'll note that we have another mix here, and that is that we have both undergraduate and graduate courses. However, you will note that there is one thing in common with all of these, and that is, well, that's why we're hoping to perhaps get some help from people outside of the business school. Sometimes that road that exists between the Salerno Center and the rest of St. John Fisher College can seem a little too wide. So what we're hoping for is we're reaching out. You see, we have data from undergraduate and graduate business majors, but this is not as diverse a grouping as we would like. So we are hereby offering an invitation. Become part of our research team. Become part of our group here. We need more data. So if you want to get involved with a research project, come and join us. After all, we can always use more data and more people involved with this research project to help us with regard to developing papers from the results. So, if you would like to get involved with our research project, well, please contact any of us. Please contact either David or Ron or myself, and we can certainly help you get involved with the project and help you, if possible, set up the exams as needed. After all, we have run this for a year, so we have some ideas to some of the issues and concerns that can come up, and as a result, well, that wisdom can help any other faculty that are hoping to start this particular project. I thank you for your time and your patience, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.